Welcome to Bloodshed Breakdown, where slasher films meet chilling conspiracy theories. We dive deep into the gore, mystery, and the sinister truths behind the stories you love. Grab your popcorn and prepare for the fright of your life. Tonight, we're taking a deep dive into John Carpenter's The Fog.
Oh, yeah, a true horror classic from 1980. And for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's more than just jump scares and spooky ghosts. It's about the unsettling idea of a town haunted by its past, literally.
Okay, so let's set the scene for our listeners. What are we dealing with here?
Picture this. Antonio Bay, this quaint little California coastal town, is about to celebrate its 100th anniversary. But under the surface of all the festivities, there's this dark secret, a really dark secret that's about to come back and quite literally bite the town.
And I'm guessing the secret is connected to the fog, right?
Exactly. This isn't just some ordinary fog rolling in. It's supernatural fog. And it brings with it the vengeful spirits of a ship's crew who were betrayed and murdered a century ago by the town's founders.
Whoa, talk about a messed up origin story for a town. So the town is literally built on bloodshed and lies.
Precisely. And the fog. Think of it as this physical manifestation of the town's guilt. And those ghosts, they're not just there to spook, they're there to collect what they're owed.
Yeah, that's already giving me chills. You know, one of the things that always struck me about The Fog is how Carpenter uses the fog itself almost like a character.
You know, what's fascinating is that he does that on a shoestring budget. Instead of relying on fancy special effects, he uses things like dry ice and clever camera work, but that actually makes the fog even scarier because it feels so tangible, almost like you could reach out and touch it.
Right. It's like it has this weight and presence slowly creeping through the town and trapping people. It hides things, creates this constant sense of dread. You're always on edge, waiting for something terrible to emerge from it.
Exactly. And that's what Carpenter does so brilliantly. He builds this atmosphere of suspense, that feeling of unease that something bad is about to happen. He makes you wait for the scares, which is sometimes even more effective than just throwing gore at you.
Let's talk about the ghosts themselves. They're not your typical mindless zombies, are they?
Not at all. They're the crew of the Elizabeth Dane, the ship that was deliberately sunk by the town's founders to steal their gold. So their vengeance is very specific, very targeted. They're after the descendants of those responsible for their deaths.
Okay, so that raises some interesting questions about justice. Is it really an eye for an eye? Does a whole town deserve to be punished for the sins of their ancestors?
Those are some of the complex themes that The Fog explores, and it does it in a way that really gets under your skin and makes you think.
Another thing I love is how Adrienne Barbeau's character, Stevie Wayne the radio DJ, fits into all of this. She's stuck in her lighthouse broadcasting warnings as the fog rolls in.
Yes. Her voice literally becomes a lifeline in the fog. And think about her isolation up there in that lighthouse. The vulnerability of the town cut off from the outside world. It all adds to the chilling atmosphere.
It's like the town itself becomes a character, this claustrophobic space that's closing in on everyone.
Absolutely. That sense of being trapped, of having nowhere to escape, that's where the real horror lies, in the fog.
And now for all our Bloodshed Breakdown listeners out there who love a good conspiracy theory, The Fog has some juicy layers to unpack. What jumps out at you?
Well, think about it. You have this town's entire history built on a lie. You have this group of powerful people who covered up a horrific crime, and who's to say they aren't still trying to keep it quiet even a century later?
Ooh, so it's not just about ghosts and revenge. The Fog is tapping into those real-world anxieties about powerful people covering things up, those hidden truths we're not supposed to know about. That's what makes it so much more than just a slasher flick.
Exactly. The Fog might be a supernatural horror, but it reflects our very real fears about corruption, about the people in charge, keeping us in the dark both figuratively and literally.
We've talked a lot about The Fog and the ghosts and the themes, but let's give a shout out to the amazing Jamie Lee Curtis in this. Following her role in Halloween, she proves she can definitely hold her own in a horror film.
She's fantastic as Elizabeth, the hitchhiker who gets caught up in everything. She brings this perfect mix of vulnerability and strength to the role, and her chemistry with Tom Atkins, who plays Nick Castle, is great. They feel like a real couple fighting for survival against these supernatural forces.
And we can't forget Janet Leigh, Jamie Lee Curtis's real-life mother, who plays Kathy Williams, one of the town leaders struggling with Antonio Bay's dark history. That family connection adds a whole other layer to the film, don't you think?
Absolutely. It makes you think about how the sins of the past can impact future generations, how those secrets can come back to haunt you even if you weren't directly involved.
Speaking of haunting, The Fog also has some pretty effective special effects. especially considering it was made on a low budget. Those glowing eyes of the ghosts, those shadowy figures emerging from the mist. How do they pull that off without a ton of CGI?
It's mostly clever camera work, backlighting, and some really well-done makeup and prosthetics. Dean Cundy, the cinematographer, deserves a lot of credit for creating those eerie visuals. He and Carpenter really knew how to use the limitations of their budget to their advantage.
I think that's part of what makes The Fog so effective. It relies more on atmosphere and suspense, letting your imagination fill in the gaps, which, let's be honest, is way scarier than any CGI monster.
It's a great example of how less can be more in horror. By focusing on the psychological and emotional aspects of fear, Carpenter created a truly terrifying and enduring film.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the chilling story, the eerie atmosphere, the complex themes, but there's one more thing we need to address before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
You're talking about the elephant in the room. Or should I say the fog bank in the room?
Exactly. The 2005 remake. A decision that left many fans scratching their heads wondering why anyone would try to mess with perfection.
I think it's safe to say that the remake missed the mark by a mile. It relied too heavily on CGI, lacked the atmosphere and suspense that made the original so special, and quite honestly, it just felt unnecessary.
Like trying to improve on a perfectly crafted symphony by adding a bunch of random instruments and off-key notes.
Exactly. The original The Fog is like lightning in a bottle, a perfect blend of talent, creativity, and low-budget ingenuity that simply can't be replicated.
So for anyone listening who is curious about The Fog, do yourself a favor and stick with the 1980 version. It's an experience you won't forget, and one that might just make you double-check the weather forecast before visiting any coastal towns.
I second that.
All right, folks, that wraps up part one of our deep dive into John Carpenter's The Fog. We've explored the plot, the characters, the themes, but there's so much more to uncover.
Stay tuned, because in part two, we're going to delve even deeper into the world of The Fog. We'll examine the production, analyze the key performances, and explore its lasting impact on the horror genre.
Don't go anywhere. The Fog is rolling in, and we're just getting started.
Welcome back to Bloodshed Breakdown. We're still lost in the fog, dissecting John Carpenter's masterpiece.
We've talked about the ghosts, the town's dark secret, and all those creepy vibes Carpenter is so good at creating. But now I'm curious about how he actually brought this story to life, especially considering it was made on such a small budget.
Right. We're talking a little over $1 million. That's practically nothing in Hollywood, even back in 1980. But Carpenter, being the resourceful filmmaker that he is, actually turned that into a strength.
So how did he do it? Did he cut corners on everything?
Not exactly. He focused on the things that really mattered for building suspense and atmosphere. Think about those iconic shots of the fog rolling in.
Oh yeah, totally creepy. It feels like it's alive, like it's hunting the town.
Exactly. And he creates those shots using simple things like dry ice and fog machines, no fancy CGI required. But because it's so simple, it feels real, almost tangible. You can practically feel the chill in the air.
That's what's so great about The Fog. It gets under your skin without relying on a lot of blood and guts. It's more about what you don't see, what's hiding in the fog.
Speaking of things hiding in the fog, we can't forget about Carpenter's score. The music in this film is a character in itself.
Oh man, the music is so good. Those eerie synth melodies, those haunting piano chords. It's like listening to a nightmare unfold.
It's minimalist, but it's incredibly effective. Each note is carefully placed to build tension and amplify the feeling of dread. And it's all Carpenter, by the way. He composed the score himself, which he did for a lot of his films.
He's a man of many talents. Now, I heard that The Fog actually went through some pretty big changes after the initial cut. Is that true? I thought Carpenter was known for being a very decisive director.
He is. But even he realized that the first version of The Fog wasn't quite hitting the mark in terms of scares.
So what did he do? Did he go back and reshoot a bunch of stuff?
He did add some new scenes, including a few more ghostly attacks to ramp up the tension. But the biggest change was the addition of that haunting prologue, the one with John Houseman narrating the legend of the Elizabeth Dane. You know, the part where he talks about the 6 greedy men who betrayed the lepers and sank their ship.
Ooh, yeah. That prologue sets the whole mood for the film. It's like a campfire story come to life. And it really hammers home that theme of history repeating itself.
It also sets up the whole conspiracy angle, right?
Yeah.
You have this group of powerful people hiding a terrible secret. It makes you wonder what other truths are lurking beneath the surface of seemingly peaceful towns.
Okay, so we've talked about the fog, the music, the behind-the-scenes changes.
Yeah.
But what about the performances? We touched on Jamie Lee Curtis and Janet Leigh, but I want to hear more about what makes their roles so compelling.
Well, with Jamie Lee Curtis, she's riding high after Halloween, but she brings something completely different to the fog. She's not just the final girl running from the killer. Elizabeth is more proactive, more resourceful, and Curtis really sells that blend of fear and determination.
I totally agree. You can see her character evolving throughout the film, becoming more confident as the danger increases.
And then you have Janet Leigh, Jamie Lee Curtis's real-life mother, playing this town leader who is grappling with the town's dark secret. It adds this whole other layer to the film, this sense of family legacy and the weight of the past.
Right. Like, how do you come to terms with the fact that your town, maybe even your own ancestors, were responsible for such a horrific act? It's heavy stuff.
It really is. And Lee brings such gravitas to the role. She's not just a stock character or a damsel in distress. She's a complex woman wrestling with her conscience, trying to find redemption for the sins of the past.
And let's not forget Tom Atkins as Nick Castle. He and Curtis have such great chemistry on screen. You really believe they care about each other and are willing to fight for each other's survival.
He's the perfect blend of rugged hero and everyday guy. He's not some invincible action hero, but he's resourceful and brave when he needs to be.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the acting, but I want to circle back to the special effects for a minute. We mentioned how Carpenter used practical effects to create the fog, but how did he bring those creepy ghosts to life?
Well, remember those glowing eyes we talked about? That's a combination of backlighting, strategic camera angles, and some simple but effective makeup tricks.
So no fancy CGI or anything like that.
Nope. It's all about using practical effects and the power of suggestion to create those chilling visuals. And I think that's one of the reasons why The Fog still holds up so well today. Those effects haven't aged in the same way that some CGI-heavy films from the 80s have.
It's like our brains fill in the missing pieces, which makes it even scarier. The unknown is always more terrifying than something you can see clearly.
Exactly. It goes back to what we were talking about before, about Carpenter's masterful use of atmosphere and suspense. He doesn't need to show you everything to scare you. He lets your imagination do the heavy lifting.
Which is why The Fog has become such a cult classic. It's a film that rewards repeat viewings, revealing new layers and subtleties each time you watch it.
And it's a film that has had a huge impact on the horror genre. It's a blueprint for how to create truly terrifying and enduring horror without relying on excessive gore or jump scares.
It proves that sometimes the simplest stories told with skill and passion can be the most effective.
So are you ready to delve even deeper into the heart of The Fog?
Lead the way. I'm ready to see what other secrets this film has in store for us. We've been through a lot, haven't we? Untacking John Carpenter's The Fog. I mean, we've gone from the creepy fog itself to those vengeful ghosts, and even touched on those real-world conspiracy vibes that our Bloodshed Breakdown listeners love.
Definitely a lot to unpack. I mean, we've gone behind the scenes, talk about the budget, the music, the actors, but now I think it's time to answer the big question.
The age-old question. What does it all mean? What can we take away from this foggy journey into Antonio Bay?
You know, for me, one of the biggest takeaways is that idea that the past can't be ignored forever. Whether it's personal guilt or, in the case of The Fog, a town's collective wrongdoing, eventually those hidden truths find a way to surface.
It's like that saying, what's done in the dark will come to light. And Carpenter uses the fog to represent that so brilliantly. It's not just weather, it's this visual metaphor for all the secrets and lies that are swirling beneath the surface.
And it's not just about the past coming back to haunt you. The Fog also shows how those in power can manipulate information, control the narrative, and keep people in the dark. Quite literally.
Right. It's like those town founders who covered up their crime for a century. They benefited from the fog, from keeping everyone else blind to the truth. And that's a theme that I think really resonates with our Bloodshed Breakdown listeners.
Absolutely. The fear of the unknown, the idea that there are forces at work trying to control what we see and believe, that's a very real anxiety. And The Fog taps into that in a really powerful way.
You know what else struck me? That sense of isolation the characters experience. Being trapped in this small town, cut off from the outside world. It feels almost like a commentary on how information overload can actually lead to isolation. We're bombarded with so much information these days, but it can be hard to know what's real, who to trust.
That's a really interesting point. It's like we're all navigating our own fog, trying to find a way through the misinformation and find those voices of reason. And that's where Stevie Wayne, the radio DJ, becomes so important.
She's literally a voice in the darkness, guiding people, trying to make sense of the chaos. And I think that's a really important message, especially today. We need to be critical thinkers, we need to seek out reliable sources, and we need to connect with others who are also searching for truth.
I couldn't agree more. And it's not just about finding the truth, it's about having the courage to face it, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. Just like the people of Antonio Bay had to confront their town's dark history, we have to be willing to acknowledge the injustices and mistakes of the past, both on a personal and societal level.
I'm so impressed by how this film works on so many levels. It's scary, it's thought-provoking, it's visually stunning, and it even makes you appreciate a good fog machine.
The Fog is a classic for a reason. It blends horror with social commentary, atmosphere with character development. It's a masterclass in filmmaking.
So wrapping things up for our Bloodshed Breakdown fans, what's the ultimate takeaway here? How does the fog fit into our love of spooky stuff and conspiracy theories?
I think it validates that feeling a lot of us have that things aren't always as they seem, that there are powerful forces out there trying to control the narrative, and it's up to us to be vigilant, to question what we're told, and to seek out the truth.
Yes, and sometimes the truth is scarier than any ghost story. Just like those town founders in Antonio Bay, there are people in the real world who benefit from keeping us in the dark. The fog reminds us to be wary of those who claim to have all the answers and to trust our own instincts.
It's a film that encourages us to think critically, to question authority, and to never stop searching for answers, even when the fog is thick and the path is unclear.
And on that chilling note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the fog. Thanks for joining us on this foggy adventure.
If you haven't seen The Fog yet, do yourself a favor and check out the 1980 original. Trust us, it's worth it.
And if you're craving more spooky discussions and conspiracy breakdowns, you know where to find us.
Thanks for tuning in. Subscribe, review, and grab our merch at bloodshedbreakdown-merch.printify.me. Stay curious, stay cautious.